The story begins with a shiver that England never truly forgot. For it starts not with a tyrant seasoned by years of power, but with a boy barely 9 years old, whose angelic face hid a mind sharpened into a weapon, long before it understood the weight of mercy. When the enormous figure of Henry VIII collapsed into death in the year 1547, England expected a pause, a breath, perhaps the softening that comes when a child inherits a battered throne. Instead, the kingdom walked unsuspecting into one of the darkest 6-year storms it would ever endure. A reign shaped by a single belief hammered into a fragile mind since birth, that a king, even a child, was God's blade on earth, and this blade would cut without shaking. Edward, son of Jane Seymour, born on the 12th day of October, in the year 1537, entered the world to gun salutes, bonfires, and the delirious relief of a king who had torn apart an entire church just to produce him. Yet that celebration was drenched in blood, for his mother died merely 12 days later, leaving him with no softness, no compassion, and no human tether except the iron hands of tutors who taught him that love was weakness, that Catholicism was evil, and that the slightest challenge to royal authority deserved fire. As other children learned play, he learned Latin, Greek, punishment, and scripture. By 6, he could debate theology. By 8, he believed heretics deserved to burn. By 9, he believed God himself breathed through his pen when he signed a death warrant. When the crown touched his small head, the kingdom did not receive a child, it received a fanatic. Around him swarmed 16 powerful men forming a regency council, but within days, even that structure shattered. Edward Seymour, the boy's uncle, seized full control and remade himself as Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector. Yet even with adults pulling the strings, the boy was no puppet. His own writings reveal a chilling absence of emotion, a fascination with punishment, and a cold gratitude each time a man or woman burned for defending the old faith. In his neat, careful handwriting, a burning was as ordinary as a cloudy sky. Within months of the coronation, the country learned the truth of its new ruler. Churches were stripped bare, their stained glass smashed, their golden chalices melted. The saints scraped from the walls as if their faces were blasphemy itself. The Mass that had shaped England for nearly 1,000 years was outlawed, and the Book of Common Prayer imposed by force became the new script of salvation. Villagers whispered old prayers only in locked barns, behind hedges, or in the dark of night, for informers lurked everywhere. A careless word could spiral into a trial. A trial could spiral into smoke, and burnings came quickly. Priests, monks, midwives, even foreign travelers. Anyone who clung to the old religion found themselves chained to stakes while slow. Deliberate fires gnawed their legs first, to give them time to scream, to break, to repent. Some did pray, some did curse, some sang until the smoke choked them silent. Edward approved everyone. When Joan of Kent refused to recant her beliefs, he signed her death warrant without hesitation. When George Van Paris denied the divinity of Christ, he too burned under the young king's unblinking gaze. In Edward's mind, fire was not cruelty, it was purity. But fire was not the only tool of this reign. Hunger arrived as well. Wealthy landowners seized common fields, throwing thousands of families from lands their ancestors had worked for centuries. Villages withered, children starved, the roads filled with vagrants, fathers carrying dying sons, mothers holding infants too weak to cry. The government answered with iron. Vagrants were branded, enslaved for 2 years, and hanged if caught again. The suffering was described in reports sent to London, yet the palace remained silent. The boy king, wrapped in velvet and incense, wrote nothing of the starvation darkening every shire. Then came the rebellions. Cornwall and Devon rose first when villagers forced priests to restore the old mass. They demanded tradition, not revolution. But Edward's government answered with mercenaries, canon, and slaughter. Unsettling for 6 weeks. Thousands died. Priests were hanged in their own church robes, and the boy king noted it in his journal with the tone of a clerk tallying grain. Norfolk rose next. 3,000 rebels died in a single battle at Dussindale. Again, the king recorded it without remorse. Meanwhile, the crown continued to loot the kingdom's remaining wealth. Chantries were dissolved. Manuscripts dating back centuries were burned for being superstitious. Gold crosses vanished into private pockets. Entire communities lost their schools, their hospitals, their charities services they desperately needed in a world where famine stalked every parish. Inside the court walls, a different kind of bloodshed unfolded. Edward signed the death of his uncle Thomas Seymour at age 11. Then he signed the execution of his other uncle, Somerset. The boy was not troubled by killing kin. He simply wrote the date, the weather, and the fact of their deaths. When the powerful Duke of Northumberland rose next, Edward embraced him with fanatical loyalty, ready to reshape the entire succession to ensure that his Catholic sister Mary would never sit on the throne. With trembling hands already weakening from the disease that would soon kill him, he wrote and rewrote the document excluding both Mary and Elizabeth, determined that Protestant Lady Jane Grey would rule, even if the kingdom burned for it. By the time his lungs filled with blood in the year 1553, Edward believed himself a martyr, dying for a godly England. His body was covered in sores. His breath rattled. His last prayer asked God to defend the Protestant realm he had forged through fire and famine. When he died at 15, the nation exhaled, a breath it had held for 6 years. But the scars remained. The broken villages, the starved children, the churches stripped of beauty, the cycle of religious vengeance that would soon be continued by Mary, then by Elizabeth. 6 years of a boy's zeal would echo for generations. And this is only the beginning. The night after the boy king died, England seemed to hold its breath the way a child holds a secret, trembling, unsure whether to speak or to hide. And in that quiet, the echoes of his reign did not fade, but instead slid through the corridors of every parish and manor house, like a draught of cold air no one could block. The kingdom felt strangely hollow, as if a great weight had been lifted only to reveal a greater one beneath it. And people who had whispered prayers to survive his years on the throne now found themselves staring into an uncertain dawn that looked no gentler than the night before. The scent of burning still clung to the air, even though no stake crackled that evening. And the memory of processions where men and women walked to their deaths with ropes biting their wrists hung in the minds of those who had been forced to watch. The boy was gone, but the world he made remained. A landscape reshaped by fear, by hunger, by fires that had eaten not just bodies but trust. And in the half-light that followed his passing, England tried to understand how a child could have left such an enormous scar across the soul of the nation. And as dawn crept out of the Thames mist, people spoke of him the way one speaks of a storm that had torn down roofs and drowned cattle, with a weary acceptance and a quiet bitterness, but also with a strange tenderness, because beneath all the ashes lay the uneasy recognition that he had been shaped, not born, into the figure he became. His reign had been like walking barefoot across broken glass laid down by others, each shard reflecting someone else's ambition. Somerset's hunger for reform, Northumberland's hunger for power, the Tudors' hunger for theological purity, and yet Edward had pressed his weight onto each piece without hesitation, convinced that pain was a sign of righteousness. Now that he was gone, the shards remained scattered across the kingdom, And as villagers stepped carefully through the remnants of ruined chantries and gutted churches, they whispered that perhaps the boy had never understood that kingship was supposed to protect the people rather than scorch them. But the truth ran deeper than the simple tale of a child misled. For the boy king had absorbed the lessons of his guardians with such fervor that he surpassed them in certainty, sharpening their doctrines into weapons they had never fully intended. And his belief in divine appointment had been so complete that every cry of the condemned had sounded to him like the world being purified. Now, in the soft murmur of summer wind, brushing past emptied altars, one could almost hear the faint echo of his prayers, their rigid cadence lingering like the chill after a fever. And the people who had lived through his reign found themselves wondering how a mind so young could have held so much conviction that doubt never found room to grow. As they rebuilt walls, replaced doors, or swept the melted remnants of defaced brass from church floors, the thought that haunted them most was not that a child had burned heretics, but that he had believed he was saving them. And as England waited for the succession to settle, an unease seeped through villages and towns like rising groundwater, invisible but heavy, because although Edward was gone, the system that had enforced his will lived on. The sheriffs, the informers, the commissioners who had walked into churches with ledgers and hungry eyes were still alive, still carrying the habits of suspicion and authority, and no one knew whether they would now shrink back into silence or adapt to the coming queen, like wolves changing how they stalked their prey. The people held their breath, because Edward's death did not erase the memories of men who had watched soldiers drag priests from pulpits, or of neighbours who had betrayed neighbours for a handful of coin. The kingdom had become accustomed to looking over its shoulder, to guarding its speech, to hiding its faith. And habits built from terror do not vanish in the morning light. As the boy king's body lay embalmed in Greenwich, the physicians who had failed to save him whispered among themselves that his lungs had collapsed long before his throne did, that the infection had hollowed his chest, just as his policies had hollowed the countryside. And yet the courtiers who filed past his bier insisted on seeing him as a saint of the new religion, a young Josiah taken too soon. That illusion clung to the air around his corpse, filling the chamber with an uncomfortable reverence that made even the hardened nobles shift on their feet, because they knew that while his face had remained soft and childlike in death, his reign had carried an iron edge sharper than many kings before him. They bowed anyway, because power demands ritual even when the heart rejects it, and perhaps because it was easier to honor the dead boy than to confront the truth of what he had become. Outside, the people did not speak of sainthood. They spoke, instead of burned homes and emptied bell towers, of the roar of cannons outside Exeter, of the way farmland now lay fenced and useless to the families who had once grazed their cattle there. When they thought of Edward, they thought of the winter when bread ran out and mothers boiled nettles to keep their children alive. They thought of the men branded with hot irons, their screams echoing in the yards of manor houses. They thought of the old widows who starved because the guilds that once fed them had been dissolved overnight. And in their quiet voices, they wondered whether a boy who had never felt cold hunger, who had grown up in rooms warmed by vast fireplaces and surrounded by velvet cushions, could ever have understood the weight of the suffering his laws unleashed. The grief they felt was not for him, but for what had been broken around him. Yet even in their grief, there was a strange softness forming an ache shaped, not by forgiveness but by the recognition that the boy had never been given a chance to be anything else. They recalled that he had grown up believing the Mass was idolatry. That compromise was sin. That kingship required obliterating whatever opposed the truth he had been taught. And when people whispered about him in the dying light of evening candles, they did so with the uneasy realization that they too had once believed children were born innocent. Now they knew better. Now they understood that innocence can be shaped into something sharper than steel when the wrong hands hold the mold. And in that understanding, Fear curled inside them, because the kingdom was preparing to crown another monarch formed by different hands, shaped by different wounds, and no one could be sure whether the next reign would heal the rifts or deepen them. As night settled again, long after Edward's body had been sealed in its wrappings, England felt suspended at the edge of a knife. It was not relief they felt, nor hope, but a restless waiting, a dread shaped by the memory of flames that had licked at countless feet and by the cries of rebels who had fallen in the fields. The boy king's ghost was not a phantom wandering corridors, but a memory pressed into the land itself, breathed out by the church walls, scraped raw, whispered through the hedges where informers once hid, carried on the wind that rustled through pastures that no longer belonged to the people. And in that restless dark, the kingdom understood that although the child tyrant had died, his aftermath was only beginning, spreading its roots into every life he had touched, every faith he had scorched, every hunger he had left behind. In the days that followed, as the kingdom drifted like a bruised animal, unsure whether to retreat into the woods or bare its teeth, a strange heaviness settled over England. Not the sharp terror that had clung to the people during Edward's rule, but a deeper, quieter weight that felt almost like the ache left behind after a long fever. The country had forgotten how to exist without the constant pressure of proclamations, of commissioners knocking on church doors with orders to strip the altars, of neighbours listening for the faintest whisper of forbidden prayer. And now that the immediate threat had fallen silent, the people found themselves moving cautiously through their own lives, as if every gesture might still be watched by invisible eyes, trained to punish the smallest disobedience. Even the birds seemed hesitant, their morning calls timid, as if the trees themselves feared waking the dead king's shadow. The court, meanwhile, vibrated with the kind of tension that precedes storms rather than endings. Because within the high walls of palaces where tapestries muted the sounds of frightened footsteps, the great lords calculated their futures with trembling precision. Beneath their layered velvet sleeves and jeweled collars, they carried the knowledge that the kingdom's next ruler would decide whether they would rise in power or be dragged to the tower within a week. They spoke softly in corridors, their words coated in honey, but carrying the bitterness of old alliances, cracking under the weight of new fear. For every man who had helped steer the child, King's Reign now wondered whether he would be held accountable for the fires they had lit in his name. The air in the council chambers grew thick with the scent of ink, sweat, and dread as they pretended to mourn the boy while quietly maneuvering to save themselves from the consequences of guiding his hand. Outside the palaces, the common people did not speak of councils or succession documents. They spoke instead of the quiet changes unfolding around them. The way church doors now stood ajar without soldiers guarding the entrance. The way some priests dared to keep candles burning again, though not too brightly. And the way mothers no longer pushed their children behind them at the sound of hoofbeats for fear that mounted officers had come to drag someone away for reciting a Latin prayer. Yet even as the fear began to loosen its fingers, no one forgot how quickly it had once tightened. And the people moved, with the caution of those who had been wounded in the same place so many times. They no longer believed healing was possible. They whispered that perhaps the kingdom was entering a gentler chapter, but they whispered it the way one speaks of spring during winter's last storm. Wary, uncertain, afraid of tempting fate. In the quiet between breaths, England began to remember what had been lost during the boy king's years on the throne. Villagers stepped into their churches as if entering the rooms of the dead, their eyes lingering on the whitewashed walls where saints once glowed with painted halos, their hands brushing the grooves where brass inscriptions had been pried away. And though they said nothing, their silence held the raw ache of a collective grief too large for words. They remembered the songs that had once filled these spaces, Latin hymns drifting upward like smoke toward arches carved by their ancestors, and they felt their absence like a physical wound, Some tried to hum the old melodies under their breath as they cleaned the floors or repaired broken pews. But the notes faltered, stumbling over memories too painful to summon fully. And the effort itself reminded them of everything the Child King had stripped from them in the name of purity. At night, when households gathered around dim fires, they spoke of the rebellions in hushed tones, not with the anger that had once driven men into battle, but with the hushed awe reserved for dreadful legends. Grandfathers described the siege of Exeter as if recounting a nightmare they had barely survived, their voices trembling as they remembered how smoke had choked the air for weeks, how friends had died in the streets, how entire families had vanished beneath the crush of soldiers who treated surrender not as mercy but as weakness. Mothers traced the burning of Joan of Kent with a sorrow that curled their lips and eyes into shapes of disbelief, whispering that they had prayed for her soul, even though the law forbade them to. And now, years later, they still felt the sting of watching a woman tied to a stake and told that fire was the only path to grace. These memories clung to England like the scent of smoke in clothing long after the fire is cold, stubborn and impossible to wash away. And through it all, the shadow of Edward himself lingered, not in the form of a king remembered fondly, but in the peculiar ache of realizing that so much suffering had unfolded under the watch of a boy whose feet had barely touched the ground. People repeated his name with a mixture of pity and resentment, unable to reconcile the innocent face in portraits with the devastation he had authorized. They spoke of his intelligence, his intensity, his unwavering belief in his own righteousness. And as they pieced together their memories of him, stories of a child who recited scripture with a fervor far older than his years, who demanded obedience with a voice still high and unbroken, who signed death warrants with the calmness of someone tallying accounts, they found themselves grappling with a question too large and too unsettling to answer. Could innocence exist in a heart taught only severity? The truth, whispered among scholars and midwives and men who had seen enough war to know that monsters are rarely born but made, was that Edward's reign had been the result of countless hands, shaping him into something unyielding, hands that belonged to ambitious uncles, stern tutors, fearful priests, and reformers who believed that purity was worth any price. The boy had been carved like stone, chiseled by doctrines that taught him to see dissent not as humanity, but as corruption. And now, as the kingdom looked back on the boy king who had left it bleeding, it understood with a slow, painful clarity that he too had been a victim, though a victim whose suffering had turned outward, growing teeth and claws and fire. In the late-night glow of dying embers, some wondered whether he ever felt loneliness in the echoing halls of his education, whether any part of him had reached for gentleness and then been struck down by the voices that taught him such softness was sin. And still, England waited. The next monarch would bring change. No one doubted that, but change itself was a blade, and the country had learned to flinch at every sharp edge. The people stood on the brink of another transformation with the weariness of those who had endured too many upheavals in too short a time, fearing that each new dawn might only bring a new kind of fire. They carried with them the memory of a reign that had lasted 6 years, but scorched centuries of tradition, and as they gathered in marketplaces, fields, and churchyards, they felt the echo of footsteps that were now forever stilled. Footsteps that had belonged to a child who had believed he was saving them, even as he tore their world apart. In the hush between one reign ending and another beginning, England lay suspended like a held breath, heavy with mourning, heavy with dread, heavy with the residue of a king who had died too young, yet left a legacy too old and too deep to ever be forgotten. In the long quiet that followed those uneasy days, England seemed to drift through a twilight of the soul, neither fully grieving the child king, nor ready to embrace what would come next. And in that suspended moment, The land moved with the strange rhythm of a body relearning how to breathe, after too many years spent bracing against pain. Villagers rose each morning with the dull heaviness of people who had forgotten what normal life looked like, stepping out into fields, still scarred by the fences of enclosure, walking past hedgerows where desperate families had once hidden from patrols. And as they worked the soil, they found themselves glancing toward the horizon as though expecting an army to crest the hills at any moment. Their nerves still tethered to memories of marching boots and the smoke of burning chapels. Even the sunlight felt different, softer yet strained, like the glow that follows a storm that is not finished but merely pausing to gather strength. The nobility, for all their luxurious surroundings, experienced their own kind of unease. One shaped not by hunger or wandering soldiers, but by the knowledge that the careful lattice of alliances they had woven around Edward now meant nothing. With the boy gone, the center of their political universe had collapsed, leaving them circling aimlessly in a void where every gesture, every whisper, every misplaced expression might betray their loyalties to the wrong person. They walked through palace halls lined with tapestries depicting kings of old men with stern faces and swords, raised high, and in those woven images they sought some model for survival. Yet none of those ancient figures could guide them through a landscape where power shifted not through battlefields but through chambers thick with incense and quiet ambition. They understood that England was entering a new reign, forged not by a child moulded into certainty, but by a woman tempered by years of exile, fear, and unwavering faith. And the thought of facing Mary Tudor's judgment made their breath shallow in their chests. Among the common people, however, the figure of Mary stirred something different. Not exactly hope, but a flicker of recognition. For many still remembered her as the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the woman they had once revered as queen before Henry's relentless crusade to cast her aside. Mothers recalled the stories their own mothers had told of Catherine's steady kindness, her devotion to the church, her quiet dignity in the face of cruelty. And though Mary herself had suffered in shadows for so long, living half her life under suspicion, there remained a sense that she understood suffering the way they did, that she had been broken and remade by grief, just as they had been broken by Edward's zealotry. Yet even this recognition did not erase the fear, because England had learned the hard way that a wounded monarch could wield power more sharply than a secure one, and Mary's wounds ran deeper than any of them could see. As couriers rode across the kingdom announcing the new queen, the sound of their horses' hooves carried a kind of tremor through the air, stirring memories of proclamations issued in Edward's name, proclamations that had led to smashed altars, burned bodies, and villages crushed under cannon fire, and people stepped out of their cottages with wary eyes, uncertain whether Mary's rule would restore what had been lost or simply replace one kind of severity with another. They watched the royal messengers pass with the same caution one uses when approaching a stranger's dog, every muscle tight, every instinct sharpened by years of fear, because no words could erase the truth that rulers, no matter how pious or justified, could turn cruel when their vision of faith collided with the world's refusal to bend before it. In the cities, where the scars of reform were etched deepest, the transition of power sent a ripple through the streets, a mixture of joy, dread, and exhausted confusion. In London, merchants gathered beneath signs depicting crossed keys and chalices that had once adorned their shops before being stripped away by Edward's commissioners. And though many longed to restore their old symbols, none dared paint them yet. They waited instead for whispers carried on the wind, for clues from the bells of Westminster or St. Paul's, for any sign of whether the new queen would reward or punish the quiet faith they had kept alive in shuttered rooms. At night, taverns filled with murmurs, some praising Mary as God's deliverance, others warning that zeal grows even more fierce when it has been denied for too long. The city, so accustomed to the boy king's harsh proclamations, now braced for a different kind of fire. Beyond the cities, in remote parishes tucked between forests and moors, priests, who had hidden relics in wooden chests or beneath loose stones in the churchyard, now dug them up, brushing away dirt with trembling hands, their eyes filling with tears as they uncovered fragments of gilded altarpieces, broken rosary beads, or bent candlesticks smuggled away during the great stripping of the churches. They whispered prayers over these objects, their voices quavering with both relief and terror, for they knew that bringing them into the light too soon could draw suspicion from those still loyal to Protestant reform. Yet the temptation was overwhelming, the urge to reclaim what had been lost, pressing against their ribs like a heartbeat. And in more than one parish, a priest lit a candle before dawn and placed it quietly on the altar. Its flame small but stubborn, a fragile sign that faith, whatever shape it took, refused to die completely. And while the kingdom held its breath, the memory of Edward lingered in subtler ways, weaving itself into the fabric of every conversation, every fear, every hope. His portrait still hung in certain halls, his pale face and solemn gaze, a quiet reminder of what fervour, untempered by wisdom, could unleash. And servants walking past these portraits would sometimes pause, feeling a strange mixture of pity and unease. They pondered the possibility that Edward had never fully understood the destruction committed in his name, that he had lived too far above the world to hear the cries rising from the countryside. And this thought softened their resentment, even as it deepened their grief. They recalled stories of him studying alone in cold rooms, his small hands turning the pages of dense theological books, his eyes tracing lines that forbade mercy. And they wondered whether he had ever looked up from those pages, longing for someone to tell him that righteousness did not require so much cruelty. As the days lengthened and the court prepared for Mary's coronation, England found itself caught between mourning what had been taken and fearing what would be demanded next. The kingdom had become a place of echoes, memories of flames flickering in every shadow, remnants of songs that once soared through vaulted ceilings, now reduced to hesitant hums. And though Mary promised restoration, no one knew whether restoration would bring solace or a new wave of judgment. Yet amid all this uncertainty, there also grew a quiet awareness, fragile but persistent, that a country cannot pass through such darkness without learning something from the depths it has endured. Perhaps it was not hope, but something gentler, something slower, the faint stirring of resilience beginning to unclench within tired hearts. And as night settled on the land once more, stretching itself over fields, towns, palaces, and the graves of those who had not survived the boy king's years, England lay in a hush that felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that follows a long confession. It knew that the next chapter would not be easy, that grief and faith and vengeance would collide again before peace found its footing. But for the first time in many years, the kingdom allowed itself a single breath that did not taste of smoke. It was not hope yet, but it was something like the memory of hope, fragile as the glow of a candle newly lit on a long-abandoned altar. In the soft tremor of the weeks that followed Mary's ascent, England found itself awakening not into clarity, but into a deeper haze, a kind of dawn where the light was pale and uncertain, as if unsure whether the land deserved illumination after the shadows it had carried for so many years. The people moved through this dawning world with the fragile caution of those who had learned to expect danger in every shift of authority. Their steps slow, their voices low, their hearts still bruised by the sternness of the child king whose reign had shaped their nightmares. It was not that they feared Mary herself in those early days, for many still remembered her mother's quiet dignity, and believed that no daughter of Catherine of Aragon could ever rule with the cold detachment of Edward. But rather they feared the unpredictable shape of change, that strange force that had torn their world apart once already and now returned, clothed in new colours, and guided by the wounds of a woman who had spent half her life outcast from her own blood. For Mary, too, the road ahead trembled with shadows, though the country could not yet see the depth of them. In the private chambers, where she prayed before dawn, her whispered devotions carried the rawness of someone who had suffered too long in the corners of palaces where she had not been welcome, her voice trembling slightly as she asked for strength to undo the wrongs she believed had poisoned the kingdom. She had been humiliated, stripped of her title, forced to watch her mother die slowly while the world celebrated her father's new wife. And these scars, deep and old, pulsed beneath the surface of her piety. In the silence of her rooms, lit only by flickering candles that cast wavering halos around her bowed figure, Mary felt the weight of responsibility pressing onto her shoulders with a force that was both sacred and terrifying. And though she longed to heal the wounds of the realm, fear lingered inside her, whispering that scars so deep could be washed clean only with a kind of fervour as sharp as the one that had shaped Edward. Meanwhile, in the villages where life carried on with aching slowness, the people attempted to rebuild the pieces of ordinary life that had splintered beneath the weight of reform. Mothers swept the entries of houses whose walls still bore faint scorch marks from past violence. Fathers led their children to fields where the earth seemed thinner and less generous than before, and priests tried to remember the cadence of the old prayers that had once rolled off their tongues like second nature. Yet even as they tried to restore the rhythms of the past, they found that some things refused to return, not because the law forbade them, but because memory itself had been wounded. Children who had grown up under Edward's stern decrees no longer knew the old holidays, no longer recalled the bright festivals that once filled their villages with garlands and songs. And when elders tried to teach them these forgotten traditions, the children listened with the distant curiosity one reserves for tales of another world. The land itself bore the marks of their grief. Churches stood half-gutted, their walls ghostly pale from the whitewash that had smothered their saints. And though some parishes tried to scrape away the paint, the images beneath were too damaged to revive. In some places, faint outlines of wings or halos lingered like bruises beneath the plaster, faint reminders of a world where beauty had once been allowed to live openly. Men who had spent years watching commissioners pry chalices from their altars now walked those same aisles with a hollowed reverence, touching the bare stone where bronze effigies had once lain, their fingers trembling as if tracing the ghosts of their ancestors. The silence inside these churches was different now. It was not the silence of reverence, but the silence of trauma, full of things unsaid and losses too deep to voice. In London, the tension was even sharper, a bright blade drawn just beneath the skin of every conversation. The nobles who had once guided the boy king's hand now lingered uneasily at court, dressed in rich fabrics that could not disguise their fear. They crossed themselves before approaching Mary, bowing deeply yet stiffly, knowing she saw in each of them the echoes of decisions made during her brother's reign. They knew, too, that Mary carried in her heart the memory of the years she had been forced to renounce her faith, to deny her mother's marriage, to live in the margins, while others feasted under her father's roof. Their gestures of loyalty now, dripping in courtesy and polished words, felt fragile and insincere even to themselves. And more than one noble returned to his chambers at night with a cold pit in his stomach, uncertain whether Mary would rule with forgiveness or with the fierce justice of one who had waited too long to reclaim her rightful place. And then there were the common folk, watching all of this unfold with a kind of weary detachment, for they had learned that politics at court was like the shifting wind on the sea, It could change direction without warning, and those closest to the throne were often the first to be swept away. They listened to rumors carried by merchants, by travelers, by priests returning from London, and each rumor painted Mary differently: a gentle restorer of the old church, a stern defender of faith, a queen determined to heal, or a queen determined to avenge. The people clung to whichever version of Mary aligned with their hopes or fears. But beneath all those interpretations lay a deeper uncertainty, a quiet dread shaped by the knowledge that any ruler passionate enough to endure years of humiliation without breaking was capable of ruling with a fierceness that could match, or even surpass, the boy they had just buried. In the evenings, when the fires burned low and the sky turned the color of cooling embers, families gathered together the way survivors cling to one another after a flood, sharing stories of the years under Edward, with the hushed tones of people recounting a collective haunting. They spoke of the rebellions their fathers had died in, of the neighbors who had vanished after being accused of attending forbidden masses, of the fields that had gone barren when too many were driven from their land. They told these stories not to frighten their children, but because they needed to speak them aloud, needed to carve their pain into the world so that it could not be erased by the next decree. In these moments, they felt a strange kinship with one another, as though Edward's reign had fused their lives into one long, trembling thread. And through all of this, the memory of the boy himself drifted like smoke, sometimes destructive, sometimes sorrowful, sometimes so faint it seemed almost gentle. There were moments, brief and unsettling, when people found themselves pitying the child king, imagining him alone in his chambers, coughing into blood-stained linen as he held tightly to the belief that he had served God. There were other moments, sharp and burning, when they remembered the fires he had sanctioned and the families he had destroyed, and in those moments they hardened their hearts again. England did not know how to mourn him, nor how to forget him, and so his memory remained suspended in the public mind. Not a tyrant, not a saint, but something far more painful, the embodiment of what happens when a kingdom hands unimaginable power to someone too young to understand mercy. As Mary's coronation drew near, and the kingdom gathered itself for another transformation, England drifted once more into that familiar realm where fear and hope mingled like mist over marshland, neither strong enough to claim victory. And in that drifting space, the people began to understand something profound, something whispered beneath their wounds, that even though Edward was gone, the kingdom he left behind had been remade in ways that no new ruler, no matter how determined, could fully undo. His legacy lingered not in statues or portraits, but in the altered souls of the people he had ruled. And as England prepared to step into the next chapter, it did so carrying the weight of his shadow, a reminder carved deep into the land that even a child's reign can leave scars time alone cannot heal. In the weeks that eased themselves across the land like a slow tide, England entered a strange season where time seemed to stretch, thicken, and coil around the memories it couldn't release. A season where the echoes of Edward's reign refused to fade, even as the kingdom prepared to walk under Mary's new banner. Life resumed in the way life always does, with ploughs returning to the fields and markets opening their wooden shutters to let in pale autumn light. Yet beneath these ordinary motions there pulsed the quiet tension of a country that had forgotten how to live without fear, its heart still clenched from the years spent bracing for soldiers, for proclamations, for flames. People moved through their days with the same hesitant care one uses when stepping across thin ice, listening for cracks, unsure whether the calm they felt now was real or merely the deceptive stillness that comes before another storm. Within the court, the atmosphere was thick enough to taste, a heady blend of incense, ambition, and the sour tang of old guilt rising from men who had served the boy king with such fervour, and now waited to see whether the new queen would let them keep their lives or sweep them aside like ashes brushed from a hearth. Mary's presence altered the very air in the palace, not with the brittle chill Edward had carried, but with a solemn weight that pressed gently yet firmly, reminding every noble who approached her that she was a woman shaped not by privilege or triumph, but by years of humiliation and quiet endurance. And because suffering does not leave the bones easily, her eyes carried a depth that unsettled even the boldest lords, a depth that suggested she remembered every slight, every isolation, every night she had prayed alone while her father celebrated a new queen in the chambers above her. Outside the palace walls, the people began to sense the shift in power through small, almost imperceptible changes that rippled through daily life like whispers beneath a door. Some churches dared to restore a few old objects, nothing bold or extravagant, only a brass candlestick placed discreetly beside the altar, or a scrap of embroidered cloth laid beneath a chalice, as if testing the air, waiting to see whether the act would summon punishment. In villages where relic boxes had been buried in gardens or beneath stable floors, men dug them up with careful hands, brushing away the soil as though uncovering the bones of ancestors. And though they did not yet display their treasures openly, the knowledge that these objects were returned to the light brought a faint warmth to their spirits. It was a warmth mingled with fear, for the people understood intimately that religion, once torn by fire, returns not as a gentle visitor, but as a force that demands restoration with the same ferocity with which it had once been stripped away. Yet the greatest tremor came not from the return of relics or the whispers of priests, but from the shifting boundaries within the people themselves. For as England slowly emerged from the shadow of a child who had ruled through doctrine and purity, it found its own soul altered in ways that could not be undone. There were those who had embraced the new faith out of fear, and now found themselves haunted by their own betrayals. Unable to shake the memory of neighbours they had reported, or priests they had abandoned. There were those who had clung to the old faith in silence, their survival dependent on their ability to hide devotion beneath layers of caution. And now, as the old symbols resurfaced, these people felt a mix of relief and sorrow, as though their endurance had been justified, but their wounds left unacknowledged. And there were those who had adopted Protestantism sincerely, who had believed the boy king's reforms were a path to truth, and these souls now feared that Mary's rise marked the beginning of their own erasure. Thus the kingdom found itself divided not by open conflict, but by fissures carved deep into memory and conscience. Fissures that made conversation delicate, worship dangerous, and trust nearly impossible. Even families felt the strain. Fathers and sons who had once prayed together now avoided the topic entirely, each uncertain of the other's loyalties, as though the 6 years under Edward had planted a seed of suspicion between generations that would take far longer to uproot than any fence of enclosure. Mothers, who had watched reformers ransack their churches while clutching their children's hands to keep them quiet, now felt an unfamiliar tension rise within them as they weighed the safety of old devotions against the fear of new reprisals. Their hearts torn between tradition and survival. In the countryside, where memories lingered like fog along the moors, the rebellions of the past years took on a mythic quality, retold around hearths as stories half warning, half lament. Men who had fought in Devon or Norfolk sat quietly, while younger men asked what the battles had been like. And though they tried to describe the sound of cannon fire, the thunder of charging horses, the screams of neighbours falling beside them, their voices faltered, for some wounds cannot be spoken plainly without reopening themselves. Instead, the old rebels spoke of the way fear had crept into their bones and refused to leave. How after the battles their dreams were filled, not with glory but with smoke and broken bodies. and how they had returned to fields that no longer felt like home, because home itself had been transformed into something unfamiliar and frail. And still, the memory of Edward seeped through the land like the aftertaste of a bitter medicine, persistent and altering. He was no longer the boy king, but something more diffuse, a symbol of the fragility of innocence and the danger of certainty. Portraits of him remained in some grand halls, their colours muted by candle smoke, and those who passed these images felt a strange shiver, as though looking at a child whose gaze held both the purity of youth and the cold detachment of someone who believed suffering was a divine instrument. The people did not know whether to blame him or pity him, and so they did both, carrying his memory with the complexity that only a deeply wounded history can bear. As Mary prepared her first major decrees, a tremor rippled through England, silent but unmistakable, like the shift of the earth before a quake. The people sensed that the restoration she envisioned would not be a gentle return to the past, but a sweeping correction, a reclaiming of what had been taken, a balancing of scales long tilted by her father and brother. They felt it in the sermons that grew slightly bolder each week, in the cautious smiles of priests who mentioned the old rites with reverent nostalgia, in the way processions began to lengthen once more as villagers dared to walk behind crosses, carried discreetly yet proudly. And beneath this rising tide of restoration lay the deeper truth that England had not yet fully learned when faith wounds. It wounds as sharply in its healing as in its breaking. By the time autumn deepened and the first chill wind swept through the hedgerows, carrying dried leaves across churchyards where unmarked graves of the rebellions lay hidden beneath the grass, England finally understood what lingered in the wake of Edward's reign, a quiet dread that even restoration could become a new form of fire, that suffering endured did not end suffering, but often passed it along like a torch. In that dread, the kingdom braced itself once more, shoulders tightening beneath invisible burdens, hearts beating with the uneven rhythm of those who know that history seldom offers respite without demanding something in return. And as night descended once again upon the wounded land, England lay awake beneath the pale glow of a moon, veiled by drifting clouds, listening to the restless wind move through the dark. And in that wind, the people heard the faint, uneasy murmur of a truth they could not escape. The child king was gone. But the path he carved through their lives had only led them deeper into a forest where shadows waited, and Mary's torch, though bright, cast long and unpredictable shapes across the ground. In the slow-turning shadow of Mary's early reign, England moved as if half awake, drifting through its days with the strange hesitation of a dreamer, unsure whether the world around them was real or merely another illusion born of fatigue and fear. And in that uncertain state, the country began to feel the subtle pulse of change creeping through its veins. It was not bold or triumphant, nothing like the thunderous reforms Edward had imposed, with proclamations sharp as blades, but rather a shifting of the air, a deepening of silence, a quiet rearranging of loyalties, as though the kingdom itself were trying to decide whether to breathe again or remain frozen in the posture of someone bracing for the next blow. The people sensed that Mary moved differently than her brother had moved, that her will was not cast in the bright, cold steel of doctrinal certainty, but in the darker, older metal of a life forged in sorrow. And this difference, though subtle, rippled outward like the slow spreading of ink through water. In villages scattered across green hills and damp fens, the first hints of Mary's rule could be traced not through laws or soldiers, but through the expressions of the priests who stepped into their pulpits with a heavier, more contemplative air than before. These men had learned caution the way a bird learns the contours of a cage. Yet now their voices carried a new tremor, a mixture of anticipation and dread, as they tried to interpret the Queen's intentions through the narrow slivers of information that drifted down from London like fragments of overheard prayers. They spoke gently of mercy, quietly of restoration, cautiously of the old faith. But beneath their measured tones lay a tension like taut fabric stretched over a wound. Because even as they longed for their church to be whole again, they feared the price that wholeness might demand. They remembered too clearly that faith, once awakened after long suppression, could rise with a ferocity no one could predict. In the market towns where gossip wove itself through the air like smoke curling through rafters, Mary's intentions became the subject of endless speculation, whispered from stall to stall with the nervous excitement of people who had lived too long under silence. Merchants debated whether her policies would ease the crushing poverty that had taken hold during Edward's years, though none dared hope too fully, for the wounds carved by enclosure and reform had hardened into scars that would not soften easily. Some believed Mary would bring back the monasteries that had once fed the hungry, cared for the sick, and offered refuge to the desperate. Others feared she would punish anyone who had embraced Protestantism, not out of cruelty, but out of a burning desire to cleanse the land of her father's sins. And in these murmured fears, the people revealed something they themselves had not yet recognized, that they had become too accustomed to extremes, too familiar with fire, too unsure of what true healing looked like. What Mary felt herself, no one knew, for she remained guarded, even in her most private moments, carrying her grief like a relic pressed against her heart. She had been shaped by abandonment, by the death of her mother, by the humiliation of being declared a bastard, by years spent learning to hide her faith as though it were a dangerous secret rather than the core of her being. And now, as queen, she walked through galleries, draped in tapestries whose colours seemed brighter than she remembered, their woven scenes of chivalry and virtue, mocking the years she had spent in the shadows. In the stillness of her chambers, she prayed not only for guidance, but for endurance, knowing that the path ahead required a strength she feared might shatter her. She felt the pressure of an entire kingdom pressing into her chest, its expectations heavy, its wounds deeper than any crown could heal. And she understood that her rule would not be remembered for peace, but for the way she attempted to reconcile a land torn between two faiths that had forgotten how to coexist without drawing blood. Meanwhile, the memory of Edward continued to echo across the countryside in subtle, unsettling ways, shaping the people's reactions to Mary's early decrees, even though he lay cold beneath the stones of Westminster. His reign had taught them that power could shift suddenly, violently, without warning. And so when priests began to speak the old prayers again, the villagers listened with the same wary attention they would give a growling animal hopeful, cautious, unsure whether to step closer or retreat. The fires that had consumed heretics still flickered in their minds. And even though Mary had not yet lit any flames, the possibility alone cast a long shadow across their thoughts. They wondered whether faith had become so tightly bound to suffering that the two could never be separated again. And this fear seeped into their dreams, turning sleep into a restless, drifting through half-remembered horrors. In London, the tension thickened, coiling around the court like a serpent poised to strike. Every noble weighed their allegiance with the precision of a man choosing between life and death, too aware that Mary's favour could elevate them to unimaginable heights, while her suspicion could send them to the scaffold within days. Their conversations became labyrinths of caution, each word chosen with excruciating care, each gesture calculated to convey loyalty without revealing fear. They remembered too vividly how Edward's counsellors had fallen one by one, swallowed by their own ambition, or undone by a single misstep. And they understood that Mary, though gentler in manner, possessed a steel within her that had been forged in far darker fires than those of her brother. They sensed that she was not merely determined to restore the old faith, but to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped from her mother and from herself. and the realization sent small shivers through their courtly masks of composure. Among the common folk, this uncertainty manifested in smaller ways, transforming everyday interactions into delicate dances of politeness and restraint. Families avoided discussing religion at supper, fearing the wrong word might be overheard by a neighbor whose loyalties lay elsewhere. Children played games that mimicked the rituals they had seen in church, tiny reenactments of processions or whispered chants. They barely understood, but their parents watched with nervous eyes, worried that innocent play might be mistaken for dangerous devotion. The people lived suspended between two worlds, one they had been forced into during Edward's rule, and one they feared Mary might demand with equal intensity. And in that suspended state, they discovered a strange fragility within themselves, a realization that their beliefs, once solid as stone, now felt as fragile as cracked glass. As autumn surrendered to the first bite of winter, the kingdom felt the slow tightening of a new inevitability, a gathering of forces that would soon collide in ways no one could predict. Mary's counselors whispered of restoring full communion with Rome. Protestant leaders whispered of escape or resistance. Priests whispered of miracles and judgments. And the people, those who ploughed fields, hammered iron, spun wool, baked bread, whispered of nothing at all. For they had learned that silence was safer than prophecy. Their lives had become a tapestry woven from the threads of old faith. New fear, and the haunting memory of a boy who had believed he could purify a nation by burning away its perceived sins. And as the year's final night stretched long and cold across the kingdom, England slipped into a hush, thick with anticipation. Its breath held in the dark, listening for the first true sign of what Mary's reign would bring. The moon drifted behind clouds. The wind rattled the empty branches of churchyard trees. And the people, wrapped in blankets beside dying embers, wondered whether the next chapter would bring healing or fire, whether their queen would be a balm or a blade, and whether history had already decided that their land must forever swing between extremes like a pendulum unable to find rest. As winter settled its cold hand across England, the kingdom seemed to fold deeper into itself, retreating the way a wounded creature retreats beneath roots and fallen branches, seeking a silence that could protect it from further harm. Snow gathered along the ledges of gutted churches, softening the harsh lines carved by years of reform and rebellion, its white stillness draping over broken altars and cracked gravestones as though attempting to soothe wounds too deeply cut for any earthly healing. Yet beneath that quiet surface, the land trembled with the awareness that Mary's reign was beginning to find its shape, not through declarations or proclamations, but through the subtle reweaving of ritual, the careful return of objects once hidden, and the growing certainty that faith, once suppressed, was now preparing to rise with a fervor equal to the force that had driven it underground. Villagers who had waited with careful patience through Mary's first months now sensed a shift in the air whenever they stepped into their parish churches. The candles burned longer, their flames flickering against the stone with a steadiness that had not been allowed in years. And though priests still spoke gently, cautiously, their voices now carried the faint glow of conviction, as though they felt the Queen's hand supporting them from a distance. The bells, long silenced, except for funerals, began to toll again, their iron voices cutting through the cold morning air with a sound that stirred old memories in the hearts of the people. Some wept without knowing why, moved by the echo of a faith that had once shaped their entire lives. Others listened with dread, their stomachs tightening with the fear that the cycle of punishment would begin anew, that the fires which had consumed heretics under Edward might now return to consume a different set of believers. In homes built of timber, darkened by age, families gathered close around the hearth, drawing warmth from flames that danced in the dimness. and they spoke in low voices of how quickly a kingdom could pivot from one extreme to another. Mothers remembered how they had taught their children to hide their beads and crosses, sewing them into hems and pockets. And now those same children watched in confusion as their parents retrieved these sacred objects and placed them once more on shelves and tables. The children asked questions in their soft, curious voices, but the mothers could not offer simple answers, for too much had been lost and too many shadows remained. It was not enough to say that the old ways had returned, because the old ways had been shattered, stitched back together, and altered by years of fear, and nothing that survives such fracture ever returns whole. Meanwhile, the nobility felt the tightening pressure of Mary's expectations encircling them like a cord drawn slowly, deliberately, around the throat. Those who had risen on the wings of Edward's reforms now found themselves stripped of influence, their alliances questioned, their past decisions scrutinized by the Queen's watchful eyes. They bowed deeply, their jeweled collars brushing the cold stone floors of the palace. But beneath their polished manners lay a swelling fear, for they knew that Mary's longing for restoration was not born from political ambition, but from a lifetime of suffering. And suffering, when given power, often demands retribution. Some nobles tried to remake themselves overnight, donning a devotion that sat stiffly on their shoulders, hoping the Queen would overlook their past loyalties. Others whispered among themselves, plotting quiet escapes or subtle resistance. But they spoke carefully, aware that even the palace walls had ears sharpened by years of betrayal. Mary herself moved through this world of shadows and shifting loyalties with a solemnity that both unsettled and mesmerized her subjects. She walked with the calm of someone who had survived the worst a life could offer. Yet something in her gaze revealed the flickering intensity of a flame that had burned too long behind closed doors. In her private chambers, she prayed with a fervor that shook her shoulders, asking for the strength to restore the faith she believed had been desecrated by her father and brother. And yet there were moments late in the cold evenings when her crown lay in a wooden case and her hands trembled from exhaustion, when even she wondered whether healing and punishment could ever be separated. She wanted her people to return to the true church, but she also wanted justice for the years she had suffered. And these desires intertwined within her like twin vines, one gentle, one thorned, impossible to separate without tearing her apart. In London, the atmosphere grew thick with whispers, as the first signs of Mary's deeper intentions unfurled themselves like vines creeping through the cracks of an old manor. Rumours spread that priests who had fled during Edward's reign were returning, carrying with them relics wrapped in linen, their faces lined by exile and yearning. Merchants muttered that the Queen sought not simply to restore the old rites, but to bind England once more to Rome. And this rumour slithered through the streets with a speed born of both hope and terror. For some, Rome was the heart of their faith, a beacon they had been forced to renounce. For others, Rome was a symbol of oppression, a foreign shadow stretching across their land. The people had lived so long under shifting doctrines that they no longer knew which version of truth belonged to them. And this confusion made them fragile, like glass cooled too quickly and prone to cracking at the slightest pressure. Across the countryside, the effects of this tension seeped into daily life in quiet, unsettling ways. Neighbours who had once shared bread during the hardest winters now avoided each other's eyes, wary of revealing too much of their loyalties. Farmers repaired their fences with stiff, focused movements, their hands trembling as they hammered wood, softened by years of neglect. For they knew that land and faith had become intertwined in a dangerous dance, and the wrong belief could cost them everything. At night, when frost spread across the fields in delicate, threatening patterns, entire villages seemed to fall into a hush, each home lit by a single wavering flame, as families whispered of the past, the future, and the fear that the cycle of persecution, unsettling, might spin again with greater force. Even the memory of Edward began to shift subtly as Mary's rule unfolded. The boy king no longer appeared solely as a figure of cold zealotry. Instead, he emerged as a symbol of a deeper tragedy, a child molded into extremism by those who sought to shape England in their own image. People remembered his pale face, his unblinking certainty, and in the cold clarity of hindsight, many found themselves wondering whether he had ever been given the chance to understand mercy, or whether his brief life had been a prison built from doctrine and expectation. This softened reflection did not erase the pain he had caused, but it did alter the shape of the wound, turning sharp anger into a dull, persistent ache. And so England moved through winter with a quiet dread, its people poised between hope for restoration and fear of retribution, their hearts caught between the memory of a boy who had ruled with fire and the uncertain promise of a queen who ruled with sorrow. The land seemed to breathe in slow, uneven rhythms, inhaling the cold air of change, exhaling the lingering smoke of the past. Each church bell that rang, each candle that flickered in a window, each whispered conversation in market alleys felt like a step along a narrow path winding through dense fog, where one misstep could send the entire kingdom tumbling into darkness once again. And as snow continued to fall, softening the scars of the land, yet doing nothing to erase the scars within its people, England braced for the moment when Mary would reveal fully what kind of healing, gentle or burning she intended to bring. The kingdom waited, breath held, hearts clenched, eyes fixed on a horizon where the faintest glow of dawn battled against shadows that refused to retreat. As the last snows of winter began to melt into the soft, cold mud of early spring, England found itself suspended in a delicate quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives, not after peace, but after exhaustion. When a nation has spent so many years bracing against storms that its silence feels less like rest and more like the emptiness that follows a confession whispered into the dark. The land carried the heavy breath of anticipation, for everyone sensed that Mary's intentions, long veiled by caution and prayer, were preparing to reveal themselves fully. And yet the revelations seemed to move with the slow inevitability of a tide that had turned long before anyone noticed. Villagers watched the thawing earth with wary eyes. Priests rehearsed old rites with trembling hands. Nobles hid their unease behind embroidered sleeves. And through it all, the kingdom listened for the faintest signal of whether the months ahead would bring healing or ignite a new wave of fear. In parishes scattered beneath low grey clouds, the people felt the shift, not through proclamations, but through the weight of the sermons that began to unfold beneath vaulted ceilings, still scarred by whitewash. The priests spoke more openly now, their voices deeper, steadier, anchored by the Queen's growing confidence. And though their words carried no threat, the people felt an undercurrent running beneath them, something old and powerful rising from the depths of memory. It was the sound of a faith returning from exile, a faith that had been battered, hidden, whispered in secret corners, and now returned with a solemn gravity that made every candle flame seem brighter. Every echo in the church seemed longer. Every breath in the pews seemed sharper. For some, this return felt like stepping into sunlight after years of wandering in mist. For others, it felt like watching storm clouds gather in slow, overwhelming silence. And in homes warmed by hearthfire and the low murmur of anxious voices, families found themselves caught between emotions, too contradictory to bear easily. Elders who had lived through Henry's rupture with Rome, through Edward's burning of heretics, through rebellions crushed beneath cannon wheels, now watched Mary's early restorations with a fragile mixture of gratitude and dread. They longed to see their churches return to the beauty of their youth, when saints glowed from the walls and processions filled the streets. But they feared that such restoration might demand payment in blood, for England had been thrown too violently between extremes to believe in gentle transitions. The younger generation, raised under Edward's stern reforms, felt an entirely different turbulence. To them, the old rites seemed strangely foreign, the restored customs unfamiliar, and though they tried to follow their parents' instructions, their hearts carried the imprint of their childhood king, the boy whose intensity had shaped their earliest memories of God, sin, and obedience. The tension that simmered within the countryside took on sharper edges within London, where the political air thickened like fog rolling off the Thames, clinging to every stone of the palace and every whispered conversation in the taverns. Mary's counsel moved with increasing determination, pushing her closer toward decisions that would redefine the nation's soul. And each step she took along this path resonated through court gossip like the echo of a distant bell, growing louder with each toll. Nobles who had once walked confidently through Edward's court now found their strength dissolving beneath Mary's unwavering gaze. For she possessed a steadiness that came not from arrogance, but from suffering. The kind of resolve forged in the years she had been forced to renounce her mother, her title, even her right to worship. And this resolve frightened them far more than Edward's brittle certainty had ever frightened anyone, because it was quieter, deeper, and infinitely more patient. Mary herself felt the pressure growing around her like a tightening cloak, heavy yet necessary, woven from threads of duty, devotion, and long-suppressed grief. Each night she knelt before her altar, her fingers clutching the rosary that had survived so many years of secrecy, and she prayed with a fervor that bordered on anguish, asking for guidance, asking for forgiveness, asking for the strength to restore England's soul, even if the act cost her the fragile peace she had only just begun to taste. She believed with every fibre of her being that the land had been led astray, that the sins of her father and brother had fractured its spirit, and she saw herself not as a queen restoring power, but as a daughter mending a wound carved into the body of her country. Yet beneath her devotion lay a quieter fear, the fear that she, too, had been shaped too sharply by loss to lead without inflicting further harm. Across the country, the memory of Edward began to shift further, slipping out of the realm of immediate grief and into the uneasy territory of legend, where the edges of truth blurred beneath the softening haze of retelling. Children who had been too young to understand his reign remembered only fragments, the tense silence of adults, the sudden disappearances of neighbours, the hollow echo inside churches stripped bare. Adults remembered more the smell of smoke, the cries of the condemned, the hollow look in the eyes of soldiers following orders they did not fully understand, but memory softened when spoken aloud. And gradually, Edward became less a figure of terror and more a symbol of the danger that arises when power is handed to someone never taught how to wield it. This reimagined Edward half-child, half-tyrant began to wander through England's consciousness like a ghost that did not yet know whether it was welcomed or condemned. And still, the kingdom waited, each passing day tightening the coil of anticipation within its chest. Rumours that Mary intended to restore papal authority spread like sparks across dry grass, igniting debates that rarely rose above whispers, yet carried the weight of potential upheaval. Some welcomed the idea with trembling joy, believing that England's soul could be mended only by returning to the ancient faith. Others recoiled, fearing foreign control, fearing persecution, fearing the possibility that Edward's fires would return under a different banner. The people had become so fractured by shifting doctrines that even the faintest breeze of change sent ripples through their thoughts. And every rumour, every sermon, every procession felt like a step towards something vast, unavoidable, and entirely beyond their control. Meanwhile, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. The rivers swelled with melting snow, carrying with them the debris of winter. And in their currents, the people saw a reflection of their own state, caught between seasons, forced to bear what had been carried from the past, while moving toward an uncertain future. Fields, once ravaged by rebellion, began to stir with the first green shoots of spring. Yet even this renewal carried an eerie stillness, as though nature itself were cautious, hesitant to grow too boldly under a sky heavy with unresolved grief. As Mary prepared the final steps of her restoration, England braced itself with the weary instinct of a people who had lived too long under shifting tides of doctrine and authority. The kingdom, balanced on the edge of transformation, felt like a great cathedral, with its doors thrown open to wind and shadow. Uncertain whether what approached outside was salvation or a new storm, villagers lay awake beneath wool blankets, listening to the restless rustling of trees outside, their thoughts circling the same unanswerable question: could a land torn apart by one child's zealotry be healed by another sovereign's wounded devotion? And if healing came, would it bring warmth, or merely a different kind of fire? And as the first true blossoms of spring cracked open their pale petals beneath the hesitant sun, England exhaled a trembling breath, knowing that the next steps Mary took would shape not only her reign but the soul of the kingdom for generations to come. The people waited, hearts tightened, voice hushed, as though standing in the pews of a vast church, listening for the moment when the organ would thunder or the candles would burn out. As spring deepened and unfurled itself across England like a cautious blessing stretched over a wounded body, the kingdom found that the weight of expectation pressing down upon it grew heavier rather than lighter, as if the soft warmth seeping into the soil only illuminated more clearly the fractures left behind by the boy king's reign. Flowers bloomed in churchyards, where unmarked graves lay hidden beneath the grass, delicate petals drifting across stone slabs carved centuries earlier. And yet even this quiet beauty carried a haunting undertone, for the land itself seemed uncertain whether it should rejoice at the return of colour or recoil from it, remembering too well how quickly light could be extinguished by decree. Fire or faith? The people moved through their days with the weary grace of those who had survived too much to trust easily in gentler seasons. Their steps measured, their voices low, their thoughts entangled in the lingering shadows of both the past and the future pressing toward them. In parishes dotting the countryside, the restored rhythms of worship began to settle into place, with a solemn inevitability that stirred old memories, but did not quite rekindle old certainty. For though priests now lifted chalices with steady hands and chanted Latin prayers that echoed like distant thunder rolling through long-abandoned valleys, the congregations that listened remained divided, their hearts pulled between reverence, fear, and the quiet confusion that comes when a kingdom's soul has been reshaped too many times. Some worshippers bowed their heads with trembling relief, tears catching in the corners of their eyes, as if their spirits recognized a song long believed lost, while others sat stiffly in the pews, their gazes sharp and uneasy, too aware that each word spoken in the liturgy carried within it the potential to ignite conflict once more. The church bells that tolled across the moors and fields rang out with deep, résonnant voix, yet even their familiar tones could not drown out the whisper that had taken root in the minds of the people that faith regained is never the same as faith preserved. At court, Mary's presence grew larger and more unmistakable, not through arrogance or spectacle, but through a quiet force that spread outward from her as though she carried within her the gravity of every sorrow she had endured. Those who approached her felt this gravity in their bones, a weight that pressed not to crush, but to remind, to command reflection, to demand sincerity, after years of shifting loyalties and calculated smiles. She listened with patience to her advisors, her counselors, her clergy. Yet beneath her composed exterior simmered a fervor that made the great nobles swallow their words and tread carefully, for they sensed that Mary's devotion, rooted in suffering, sharpened by loss, was not a force that could be moderated or softened by political convenience. And so they walked the polished corridors with their heads bowed just slightly lower, each step a quiet testament to their recognition that a new era was rising within the Queen, an era governed not by the brittle severity of a child, but by the unwavering determination of a woman who had grown familiar with the taste of grief. In taverns thick with smoke and whispered rumour, men debated the direction Mary's reign would take, their voices carrying a tension that rode the edge between hope and dread. Some argued that the Queen longed only to restore the faith of her mother, to heal the wounds carved into the nation's spiritual life, and that her severity, if it came, would be measured, tempered, a necessary correction after years of forced reform. Others spoke with more caution, insisting that Mary's suffering had forged in her a zeal as potent as Edward's, though shaped by older traditions and aimed at different targets, and that the fires that had once consumed Protestants under her brother were not the only flames England might see. These debates flickered across the entire kingdom, travelling from village markets to cathedral cloisters, from manor houses to lonely cottages perched on windswept hills, and in every corner of the land, the people carried the same question in their hearts. Could a nation, battered by one child's tyranny, find solace under the rule of a queen born from pain? Meanwhile, the memory of Edward, though softened by time, lingered like a chill in a room that never fully warms. His portrait, still hanging in certain halls, I felt like a relic of a dream gone wrong. The painted face of a boy who had believed he was chosen to purify the world and who had never been taught the gentleness that might have saved him from becoming the instrument of others' ambitions. People spoke of him with a curious mixture of bitterness and pity, as though unable to decide whether he had been a monster shaped by doctrine or a broken child pressed into a mold he could not escape. And in these conversations, whispered beneath rafters or beside hearth, fires burning low, the nation revealed a truth. It had been slow to recognize. Edward's reign had become less a political chapter and more a scar woven into the soul of England, a reminder of how easily righteousness could turn cruel when wielded without mercy. As Mary moved steadily toward full restoration of the old faith, the kingdom braced itself once more, sensing that a reckoning long delayed was approaching. The first arrests, quiet and carefully targeted, rippled through London like the faint crack of ice across a lake. Subtle, yet unmistakable. People heard of interrogations, of interrogated clergymen, refusing to renounce Protestant beliefs, of men who had risen under Edward, now finding themselves under scrutiny in dimly lit chambers. The Queen had not yet turned to fire, but the possibility hung in the air like the lingering smoke of a pyre long extinguished. England felt the tremor of this possibility deep in its bones, for it knew that the land had not yet washed itself clean of the cycle of persecution and retaliation, a cycle that had begun long before Edward, but had sharpened into its cruelest form under his brief reign. Families lay awake during these nights, the glow of dying embers casting faint orange shadows on their walls, and spoke in cautious tones of the storms gathering around the palace. They wondered whether Mary's justice, when unleashed, would bring healing or multiply grief, whether her determination to restore the old ways would muffle the unrest or fan it into flames. And beneath all their worry lay a quieter fear, the fear that England, wounded by too many abrupt changes in too few years, no longer possessed the strength to survive another spiritual upheaval without shattering entirely. Even the land itself seemed tense, as though the earth remembered the blood spilled during Edward's suppression of the Prayer Book Rebellion. The trampling of hooves, the thunder of cannon rolling across fields that had once known only the gentle rhythm of ploughs. Spring flowers, emerging in timid clusters, swayed in the uncertain breeze as though unsure whether to open fully or retreat back into the soil. Rivers swelled with meltwater, moving with a restless urgency that mirrored the unease of the people watching from their banks. And in this uneasy season, this threshold between fear and resolve, between memory and transformation, England began to sense that the story of its suffering was not ending with Mary's rise, but shifting into a new form. The boy king's shadow, long and thin as a blade, stretched behind every decision she made. A haunting reminder of how fragile a kingdom's soul becomes when shaped by fire rather than compassion. Mary, too. I felt this shadow following her, pressing against her footsteps as she moved through her chambers, reminding her that the wounds she sought to heal had been carved not only by policy but by a child's unwavering belief that truth could be enforced through suffering. As the days lengthened and the light grew stronger, England stood upon the edge of another uncertain dawn, poised between its longing for restoration and its fear of repetition. And in that fragile balance, the kingdom breathed deeply, its chest rising with the weight of centuries, its future trembling like a candle flame, fighting to hold its shape in a draught that whispered of both salvation and ruin.